The autumn of 2022 had settled over Briarwood Heights, a quiet, middle-class neighborhood nestled in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. The trees, heavy with the weight of falling leaves, painted the streets in fiery hues of orange, red, and gold. In this picturesque suburban enclave, everything appeared perfect on the surface: neat lawns, tidy homes, and friendly smiles exchanged between neighbors. But beneath the charming facades, there were secrets lurking in the shadows, ready to unravel in ways no one could anticipate. At the center of this seemingly idyllic neighborhood stood the Harrison family. Jack Harrison, a man in his early 30s, was the embodiment of what many would consider the perfect husband and father. He was well liked by everyone, a devoted family man who spent his weekends coaching his son's little league team and volunteering at local charities. His smile was warm, his demeanor reliable. He was the kind of man you could count on, the kind of man everyone admired. Yet, behind his charming smile and flawless exterior, Jack felt a restlessness, a void that had been growing deeper with each passing day. His marriage to Emily Harrison, a woman he loved, had settled into a quiet routine. Their home was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, and their life was one of comfort and predictability. But for Jack, that predictability had begun to feel suffocating. The passion, the excitement, had slowly ebbed away, leaving behind only the monotony of daily life. Emily, now in her early 30s, was a devoted mother. Her world revolved around her 2 young children, and her days were filled with playdates, grocery runs, and the kind of nurturing that only a mother could provide. She had always prided herself on creating a loving home, a place where her family could feel safe and supported. But in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the children were asleep, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She loved Jack, she truly did, but lately, she'd noticed the subtle changes in his behavior, the late nights, the distracted glances, the small, distant silences that had begun to form between them. She knew something was wrong. She just couldn't figure out what. Her instincts, honed over years of motherhood, told her that Jack wasn't as present as he once was. But the love she had for him, and the life they had built together, kept her from confronting him, or even acknowledging the unease growing within her heart. Their lives, like those of their neighbors, were marked by a fragile veneer of perfection, one that only those closest to them could see beginning to crack. And then, like a sudden storm on the horizon, the arrival of Ava Turner would bring about the change none of them could have predicted. Ava Turner, in her late 20s, had recently moved into the house next door. The moment she stepped foot into Briarwood Heights, she made an impression. Ava was beautiful, vibrant, and charismatic, effortlessly drawing people to her with a warmth and energy that seemed to light up the whole neighborhood. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, like they had known her for years, even if it was only their first conversation. She was the kind of woman who entered a room and immediately commanded attention without even trying. And though she was a stay-at-home mom, with 2 young children of her own, Ava carried herself with a grace that made her seem almost out of place in this quiet suburban world. Her presence was magnetic, and it wasn't long before she became a beloved figure in the neighborhood. Emily had noticed Ava immediately. She had welcomed her with open arms, as any good neighbor would. But there was something in Ava's smile, something in the way she seemed to effortlessly capture the attention of those around her, that made Emily feel uneasy. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, but a feeling that she couldn't quite shake, a strange sense of competition she hadn't expected. Ava's bright personality, her charm, her undeniable beauty, it all seemed so effortless, while Emily struggled with the weight of her responsibilities at home. Jack, however, was drawn to Ava in a way he hadn't expected. It was subtle at first, just small moments, fleeting interactions during the community events or when they'd pass each other in the yard. But as time went on, Jack couldn't help but notice the way his heart would race whenever Ava smiled at him. There was something about her, something unfamiliar and exciting, that made him feel alive again, like he had been waiting for a spark, for something to awaken him from the monotony of his life. And the more he saw her, the more he found himself intrigued by her. It wasn't long before their conversations began to linger, their exchanges filled with playful teasing and light-hearted banter that only made the attraction between them stronger. For Emily, the growing friendship between her husband and their new neighbor didn't go unnoticed. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the friendly interactions of neighbors getting to know each other. But as time went on, and the frequency of Jack and Ava's interactions increased, Emily's suspicions began to mount. There was a palpable tension between the two of them, a chemistry that she could no longer ignore. It was clear to her that something had shifted, but whether it was just a fleeting connection or something deeper, she couldn't yet tell. The unease that had been quietly brewing in her heart began to grow louder, and for the first time in years, Emily found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about her marriage. The stage had been set, and the lives of the Harrisons and the Turners were about to be irrevocably changed. In the quiet streets of Briarwood Heights, beneath the shimmering autumn leaves, something dark and unexpected was unfolding, and no one was prepared for the consequences that would follow. As the crisp autumn air lingered in Briarwood Heights, the subtle dance between Jack and Ava continued to evolve, their interactions no longer confined to polite neighborly exchanges but deepening into something more intoxicating, something unspoken. The lines between friendship and flirtation began to blur, each encounter more charged than the last, and neither of them could, or perhaps wanted to, deny the growing attraction between them. At first, their conversations were innocent enough, born from shared interests in community events and the love of gardening. Jack would often find himself volunteering for a local event or tending to his garden, only to run into Ava. The way she would smile when she saw him, the light in her eyes as she spoke, created an undeniable energy between them. It was more than just casual conversation, it was a connection, a spark. Jack found himself looking forward to these encounters, their light-hearted banter like a breath of fresh air amidst the monotony of his daily life. Ava, for her part, was equally drawn to Jack. There was something about him, something that stirred her. He wasn't like the men she'd known before. He was kind, attentive, but also distant. There was a complexity to him, a quiet depth that piqued her curiosity. His easy smile and charm were enough to captivate anyone, but as she spent more time with him, Ava began to sense something more, something unspoken. She noticed the way he would glance at her when he thought she wasn't looking, the small, lingering touches when they brushed past one another. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she felt it, the electric current between them, growing stronger each time they were together. Their first real moment of connection came on a sunny Saturday morning in October, when they both found themselves in their front yards at the same time, working on their gardens. Jack had been planting new flowers when he heard Ava's voice call out to him. "Hey, Jack. I was thinking about planting some daisies this year. What do you think?" Ava's voice was bright, warm, and inviting. Jack looked up, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think daisies are a great choice," he said, walking over to the edge of the fence that separated their yards. "They'll do well here. I've got a few in the back, they seem to thrive in the sunlight." Ava's eyes sparkled as she leaned over the fence, her hand brushing against his as she handed him a small sprig of the flower she had been working with. "I just love how easy they are to take care of," she said, her voice softening. "Kind of like a symbol for simplicity, don't you think?" Jack's heart skipped a beat as their fingers brushed, the contact sending a jolt of electricity up his arm. He tried to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered, and he couldn't ignore the pull that was growing stronger between them. As the weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent, and each time, the tension between them seemed to heighten. They began meeting on Jack's front porch for coffee in the mornings, talking about everything from their children to their hopes and dreams. The conversations felt effortless, the words flowing easily between them, and every exchange left them both yearning for more. It was during one of these coffee chats that the tension finally became palpable. Jack was sitting across from Ava, their legs nearly brushing as they sat side by side on the porch swing. The soft, cool breeze stirred the leaves in the trees, but neither of them seemed to notice the autumn chill. They were caught in the warmth of each other's presence. "So, what's your biggest dream, Jack?" Ava asked, her voice suddenly serious, her eyes searching his. Jack hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He had never really thought about his dreams in a long time. The responsibilities of work, family, and life had always been more pressing. But in that moment, with Ava looking at him with such intent, something stirred within him. I guess I've always wanted to feel more alive, you know," he said slowly, the word surprising even himself. "I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do. The right job, the right house, the right family. But I don't know. I feel like there's something missing. Like there's more out there for me." Ava's gaze softened, and for a moment, their eyes locked in mutual understanding. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin, and a subtle smile crossed her lips. "I get that," she murmured. "Sometimes, it's like we're all just going through the motions, right? Just waiting for something to happen." Jack's heart raced as he found himself leaning in closer, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. Her proximity, her scent, the way she made him feel, alive, seen, was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It was intoxicating. But just as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Jack pulled back, clearing his throat, suddenly aware of the line they were dangerously close to crossing. He looked away, his hands trembling slightly as he took a deep breath. I should get back inside," he said, standing up abruptly. "The kids will be back soon." Ava nodded, though her eyes betrayed her own disappointment. "Yeah, of course," she said, standing as well. "I'll see you later, Jack." As Jack walked back into his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something irreversible. Ava's words had struck a chord deep within him, and he knew that whatever had begun between them was no longer just a fleeting connection. It had grown into something more dangerous, something that couldn't be undone. At the same time, Emily had noticed the growing closeness between her husband and their new neighbor. It wasn't just her imagination, she could see it in the way Jack looked at Ava when they spoke, the way his tone softened, the way his smile lingered a moment too long. The unease in Emily's chest had begun to twist into something darker, something more dangerous. She knew something was happening, but what exactly, she couldn't yet tell. The tension in Briarwood Heights was palpable, and as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the lives of the Harrisons and the Turners would soon be changed forever. Every glance, every touch, every unspoken word between Jack and Ava was leading them toward a breaking point, a point where nothing could ever be the same again. The crisp air of early winter settled over Briarwood Heights, and with it came a subtle shift in the mood of the neighborhood. As the holidays approached, the streets were lined with twinkling lights, the hum of Christmas carols echoing from house to house. Yet, within the walls of the Harrison home, there was a growing sense of discomfort, a tension that Emily could no longer ignore. For weeks, Emily had sensed something was wrong. The small changes in Jack's behavior were impossible to overlook, the late nights at work, the way he would suddenly glance at his phone whenever she entered the room, the distracted, distant air he wore like a second skin. It wasn't just the time spent away from home, though that was enough to make her uneasy, it was the way he had started to retreat into himself, as if there were a part of him that had shut her out completely. Emily's heart ached with each passing day, as she wondered if this was just the natural ebb of a marriage that had been steady for so long, or if something darker was at play. The unease gnawed at her, and despite her love for Jack, Emily couldn't ignore the whispers in the back of her mind. She was no longer able to convince herself that everything was fine. There was a deep, instinctive feeling within her, a sense that she was losing him in some way, but she couldn't put her finger on why. And then came the moment when everything changed. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon, just after lunch, when Emily was tidying up in the kitchen. The house was quiet, the children were napping, and Jack was supposed to be at a meeting, as he had claimed. As she walked past the kitchen counter, something caught her eye, a glint of light from Jack's phone, lying face up. A single notification blinked on the screen. Curiosity, mixed with a feeling of dread, pulled her toward the phone. She knew she shouldn't, she'd never gone through Jack's things before, but the nagging doubt had been growing inside her for too long, and in that moment, she couldn't stop herself. With a shaky breath, she picked up the phone and saw a string of messages from Ava Turner. Her heart stopped as she read the messages, flirty, intimate, even suggestive. Each word was a blow to her chest, each sentence a confirmation of her worst fears. She had been right all along. Her husband, the man she had trusted more than anything, had been slipping away from her, caught in the web of an affair with their neighbor. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, a mixture of disbelief, hurt, and rage flooding through her. She scrolled through the messages, her fingers trembling with each new line. Photos. Smiles. Words that felt like daggers. She had seen the way Jack and Ava exchanged glances, the way he smiled at her with a warmth that was no longer reserved for Emily. But seeing it all laid out in text, seeing it in black and white, it felt like a betrayal in its rawest form. The person she had loved, the father of her children, had been living a double life, and she had been blind to it. The realization hit her hard. She felt sick, betrayed, and powerless. How could he do this to her? To their family? But there was no time to dwell on the shock. Emily knew she had to act. She couldn't just let this go. She wouldn't. But as she stared at the phone in her hands, a cold fury began to settle within her. She wasn't going to confront Jack just yet. She needed to think, to plan. This wasn't something she could handle in the heat of the moment, not with so many emotions swirling around inside her. No, she would need proof, solid, irrefutable evidence before she took any further steps. Emily placed the phone back on the counter, her hands still trembling as she stepped back. A wave of nausea rolled over her, and for a moment, she almost lost her footing. She steadied herself against the counter, trying to calm her breathing. The world seemed to spin as the enormity of what she had discovered weighed on her. But there was one thing she knew for sure, she was not going to let Jack or Ava get away with this. She had to confront him. No, she would confront him, but only when she had the full truth. The next few days were a blur. Emily went about her routine, caring for the children and maintaining the house, but inside, everything felt different. The joy that had once filled her heart when Jack walked through the door was gone. Now, every time she saw him, she felt a wave of anger and sorrow threaten to overwhelm her. The facade she had been living behind for so long was crumbling, and she could see it now. Jack wasn't the man she thought he was. He was a stranger, someone who had betrayed her in the most intimate way possible. That Friday evening, when Jack finally came home from work, Emily was waiting. She had spent the afternoon preparing herself, mentally, emotionally, for what was to come. She had already made up her mind. She couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine anymore. He had to know that she knew. When Jack entered the house, Emily was in the kitchen, her back to him as she busied herself with dinner preparations. The sound of his footsteps was faint against the hardwood floors, but she could hear the change in his footsteps. He had slowed down, hesitant. "Hey, Emily," Jack's voice broke the silence, a little too cheerful, a little too forced. Emily didn't turn around. She kept her hands busy with the vegetables on the counter, her face betraying nothing. But inside, her pulse raced, and her hands tightened around the knife she was holding. "Jack," she said, her voice low, controlled. "We need to talk." There was a pause, followed by the sound of him setting his keys down on the counter. She could feel his eyes on her, the weight of his gaze heavy. He knew something was wrong. She didn't have to see it to know. "Sure, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice wavering ever so slightly. He must have sensed the change in her tone, the edge to her words that wasn't there before. Emily took a deep breath, gathering her courage. This was it. She had to do this. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure what she was expecting from him, but nothing could prepare her for the guilt that flooded his face when he saw her. "I know about Ava," she said, her voice cold, cutting through the silence between them like a knife. "I know everything." Jack froze, the blood draining from his face. The guilt in his eyes was unmistakable, and for a moment, Emily thought he might try to deny it. But when he opened his mouth to speak, the words never came. He was trapped. Emily didn't need any more answers. She had all the proof she needed. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about her, about their family. And she was done pretending she didn't see the truth. The evening after Emily's confrontation with Jack was thick with an unbearable silence. The usual hum of family life had been replaced by a heavy quietness, the kind that settled deep into the walls, leaving every room suffocating with the weight of unspoken words. Jack hadn't even tried to explain. When Emily told him she knew about his affair with Ava, the color drained from his face, and he looked at her as though the world had collapsed around him. There was no immediate defense, no feeble excuses, just a long, uncomfortable pause. Now, hours later, Jack sat on the couch in their living room, staring at the floor as if it held the answers to everything. His mind was racing, each thought crashing into the next, but nothing could erase the crushing weight of Emily's accusation. His heart hammered in his chest as he replayed their conversation, the way Emily had confronted him with cold, unwavering certainty. She knew. There was no running from it anymore. Emily had retreated to their bedroom, and Jack hadn't tried to follow. There was nothing he could say, nothing that would undo the damage. She had seen the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sitting there in the silence, Jack's thoughts drifted to Ava. He could still feel the warmth of her presence, the way she had made him feel alive, desired, in ways Emily hadn't for months, maybe longer. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was quickly followed by a stronger, more selfish emotion, the fear of losing it all. Their family. His life as he knew it. How could he explain the unexplainable to Emily? Could he even salvage this? But deep down, Jack knew that the decision wasn't his to make anymore. Emily's face haunted him, her eyes filled with betrayal, her voice steady yet seething with a pain that he couldn't fix, not now. The damage had been done, and nothing could put the pieces of their marriage back together again. Meanwhile, in the bedroom, Emily was lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts spinning. She had demanded the truth from Jack, but now that she had it, she wasn't sure how to handle it. She had always prided herself on her intuition, on knowing her husband, but this? This was a betrayal that went deeper than anything she could have imagined. Her mind kept returning to Ava, the woman who had wormed her way into Jack's life, into their home, their family. Emily thought back to the small moments, the subtle shifts that she had ignored at first. The late nights, the excuses, the way Jack's eyes would linger just a little too long when Ava was around. It was as though Emily had seen all the signs and simply chosen not to believe them. She wanted to trust Jack. She wanted to believe in the man she married, the man who had promised her forever. But now, that promise felt like a lie. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry, not yet. There was something she needed to do first. She needed to talk to Ava. The thought of confronting the woman who had invaded her life in the most intimate way filled her with a cold fury. Ava was no innocent bystander, she had played her part in this destruction, and now Emily would hold her accountable. The next morning, Emily didn't speak a word to Jack. She moved through the motions of the day with an icy calm that she hadn't known she possessed. She made breakfast, took care of the children, even smiled when they came running into the kitchen with sleepy eyes. But in her mind, she was already planning what came next. There was no room for indecision anymore. She had to face Ava, and she would do it today. When Jack left for work, Emily didn't hesitate. She dressed in something simple, something that wouldn't draw attention, but still carried the weight of authority. She couldn't afford to look weak, not now. She called Ava's house, telling her that she needed to talk. When Ava agreed, Emily felt a surge of determination rush through her. It was time to confront this woman head-on. The drive to Ava's house was one of the longest of Emily's life. Her mind churned with 1,000 thoughts, but one kept repeating itself: I need to take control back. For too long, she had ignored the cracks in her marriage, but now, they were gaping wide open, and there was no turning back. Ava's house stood just a few streets away from hers, a modest but well-kept home that mirrored the same suburban perfection Emily had once taken for granted. The windows were framed with cheerful wreaths for the holidays, the front porch adorned with pumpkins and twinkling lights. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, as if the world hadn't been turned upside down. Emily knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. When Ava opened it, her bright smile faltered for just a moment before she quickly regained her composure. "Hi, Emily," Ava said, her voice a little too light, too cheerful. "What's this about?" "I think you know," Emily replied, her voice low but steady. She didn't wait for Ava to speak again. Instead, she stepped past her into the house. The air was warm, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled in Emily's chest. She looked around, taking in the cozy, homely decor. This was the place where Ava had built her life, where her family lived, right next door to the woman she had betrayed. Ava shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what you mean. We can talk, but—" Emily cut her off, her voice sharp, her control unwavering. "I know about you and Jack. Don't play dumb with me. I've seen the messages, the pictures. You think I didn't notice? You think I wouldn't find out?" Ava paled, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for words. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. That's all you have to say?" Emily's voice cracked with the sting of pain she couldn't suppress. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You didn't care about the consequences? About my family? About my children?" Ava's eyes filled with guilt, but there was something else there too, fear. She took a tentative step back, her hands wringing nervously. "Emily, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I thought it was just enough." Emily's words cut through the room like a blade. "It doesn't matter what you thought. You knew what you were doing. You knew the whole time." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, suffocating. Ava opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Emily stood there, her chest heaving, the cold anger now bubbling to the surface, mingled with a deep sadness that she couldn't push aside. She had come here for answers, but now, she wasn't sure what she was hoping to find. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice quiet, but laced with raw emotion. "I want you to stay away from my family. And I want Jack to know what you've done. This ends now. No more secrets." Ava nodded, her face flushed with shame. "I understand." As Emily turned to leave, her mind raced with what had just transpired. She didn't know what the future held for her marriage or her family, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to let this betrayal define her. She was stronger than that. And no matter what happened next, she would find a way through it. With the weight of the conversation hanging in the air, Emily walked out of the house, the door clicking shut behind her. But inside, a storm was brewing, and it was far from over. The days following Emily's confrontation with Ava were a blur, a confusing haze of emotions and uncertain actions. Emily had done what she felt she needed to do: she had confronted Ava, demanded accountability, and laid bare the betrayal that had shattered her world. But even with Ava's apology hanging heavily in the air, Emily felt no relief. Her anger still simmered beneath the surface, and the weight of what had been done to her family, was like a heavy stone lodged in her chest. Jack, for his part, seemed to retreat further into himself. After Emily's revelation that she knew everything, his behavior had become erratic. One moment, he would attempt to apologize, his voice trembling with regret, but the next, he would retreat into silence, as though the enormity of his actions had paralyzed him. Emily didn't know what to make of it. The man she had once known, the man she had loved, seemed to be slipping away, consumed by guilt and the realization that his lies had been exposed. The person he had become was a stranger to her. It was a Wednesday evening when everything came to a head. The kids were at a friend's house for a sleepover, giving Emily and Jack a rare moment of privacy. As she sat in the kitchen, staring absently at the half-empty glass of wine in front of her, Emily realized something. She was done waiting for Jack to fix this, to somehow magically return to the man she had married. She was done hoping that he would take responsibility for the mess he had made. No more. It was time to act. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as she waited. Jack was in the living room, his head buried in his phone as he fidgeted nervously. Emily knew he was waiting for the right moment to speak, to explain, to apologize. But she couldn't bear the thought of hearing another word of his excuses. She didn't want his apologies anymore. What she wanted was justice, closure, an end to the torment that had been tearing them apart. With a deep breath, Emily stood up from the table. Her hand gripped the back of the chair, her knuckles white with tension. She knew this was the moment. She had to do this. She couldn't keep pretending like everything was okay. The betrayal was too much, and her heart had shattered beyond repair. She walked into the living room, her steps firm and purposeful. Jack didn't look up as she approached. He was still glued to his phone, eyes flickering nervously over the screen. For a moment, Emily just stood there, watching him, feeling a strange detachment from the man she had once trusted. "Jack," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, but it carried weight, so much weight that it stopped him cold. He looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes filled with regret. "Emily, please. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Stop," Emily cut him off, her voice sharp now, cutting through the room. "I don't want to hear it anymore. You've betrayed me, Jack. You've betrayed this family. And I won't stand by while you continue to lie to me." Jack stood up, his face stricken with panic. "Emily, please. I love you. I didn't mean for it to go this far." But Emily wasn't listening. She felt the fire of rage burn hotter within her. It was a strange feeling, this overwhelming sense of power, of control. For the first time in weeks, she felt clear-headed, decisive. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the one who would take charge. "Do you love me?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you even know what that means anymore, Jack? Because I can't recognize the man I married. The man I thought I knew, he's gone." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but Emily didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to hear him beg, apologize, or explain. She had been patient. She had given him every chance to come clean, to take responsibility, but now it was her turn to take control. Her gaze drifted to the kitchen, where the knife block sat on the counter, its sleek blades gleaming in the dim light. A cold, irrational thought crossed her mind. She had no intention of using it, but the thought lingered, its dark temptation swirling like a shadow at the edges of her consciousness. Jack took a step closer to her, his hand reaching out as if to comfort her, but Emily recoiled. The touch of his hand felt foreign, a betrayal in itself. "You don't get to touch me anymore," she said, her voice low and filled with an intensity that made Jack freeze in place. "You've taken everything from me. My trust. My love. My family. And now, I'm taking control back. No more lies. No more pretending." A long silence stretched between them. Jack's breathing was shallow, his face flushed with a mixture of fear and guilt. He looked like a man who was on the verge of collapse, a man who knew there was no going back, no way to fix what had been broken. "I don't want to lose you, Emily," Jack whispered, his voice cracked and desperate. "Please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Just tell me what you need." Emily's gaze softened, but only for a moment. She had heard all his pleas before. She had heard the promises. She had listened to his remorse and watched as he went back to the same old habits, the same old lies. She couldn't keep living like this. She couldn't keep waiting for a man who would never truly change. "I need you to leave," Emily said, her voice calm but resolute. "I need you to leave, Jack. It's over." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Jack didn't move. His face crumpled in disbelief, as though he couldn't comprehend the finality of what she had just said. But then, slowly, he backed away, his eyes still fixed on her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, more to himself than to her. And with that, Jack turned and left the room, leaving Emily standing there, alone. She heard the door slam shut behind him. But as the finality of it all settled in, a dark, unfamiliar weight filled her chest. For a brief, horrifying moment, Emily wondered if she had made the right choice. Her emotions were a tangled mess: anger, relief, sadness, and guilt. The man she had loved was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. And yet, something else lingered, a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. She had taken control. She had made the choice. But now, as the dust settled, she couldn't shake the feeling that what she had done wasn't enough. The pain was too deep, the betrayal too complete. There was still something unresolved, still something lingering in the shadows. The cold winter evening descended slowly on Briarwood Heights, casting long shadows over the streets and quiet homes. Emily had made her decision. She had taken control of the narrative, severing the final ties between herself and Jack. And yet, as she sat alone in the house they had built together, the weight of her choices began to settle in, heavy and suffocating. The kids would be back tomorrow, their laughter filling the halls, oblivious to the wreckage that had been set in motion. But for now, it was just her, the silence, and the echo of what had been lost. Jack had left that night, his departure a quiet one. He hadn't fought back, hadn't pleaded. The man she once knew had simply walked away, leaving her with the unbearable truth that their marriage was over, and there was no going back. She couldn't bring herself to cry, not yet. But the tears were there, simmering beneath the surface, ready to boil over. How could she have let things get this far? How had she not seen the cracks in the foundation sooner? The guilt was sharp, like a knife twisting in her gut, but it wasn't enough to change what had already happened. She had to accept that. The following days were a blur of routine, keeping up appearances for the children, forcing herself to smile even when it felt like the weight of the world was crushing her. She went through the motions, making breakfast, driving the kids to school, running errands, but it was all mechanical, as though her body was on autopilot and her mind was far removed. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping away, like sand through her fingers, and that no matter what she did, the life they had built together was already beyond repair. Jack hadn't returned to the house since that night. Emily had made sure of it. She had told him to leave, and he had complied, though it seemed like a decision that was as much out of shock as it was of acceptance. He didn't reach out, didn't try to call, as though he knew there was nothing left to salvage. There was no apology he could offer, no explanation that could make things right. The betrayal had run too deep. The damage was irrevocable. Weeks passed, and the numbness that had settled over Emily began to fade, but in its place, a dull, gnawing ache took its place. The house felt emptier now, even with the children's constant chatter filling the rooms. Without Jack's presence, the home that had once been a symbol of warmth and togetherness felt hollow. It was just her now, and the unfamiliarity of it terrified her. There were days when she wondered if she had made the right choice, if there had been a way to fix things. But then she would remember the way Jack had looked at her that night, the shame in his eyes, the guilt that had consumed him. She couldn't go back to that man, couldn't trust him again. The truth was, she had already lost him long before she found out about the affair. But what hurt most was not the betrayal itself, it was the loss of herself in the process. She had spent so many years investing everything into her family, into Jack, that she had lost sight of who she was. She had become defined by the roles she played, mother, wife, caretaker, but in the silence left by Jack's absence, she realized she had forgotten how to be just Emily. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. The woman who had once dreamed of a perfect life, a perfect family, was now staring at the shattered pieces of that dream, unsure of where to go from here. Then there was Ava. Emily had never expected the confrontation with her to be anything more than a way to take back control, but it lingered in the back of her mind, unresolved. Ava had apologized, but Emily knew there was more to the story, more hidden behind those perfect, doe-like eyes. Ava wasn't the innocent bystander she had portrayed herself to be. She had known what she was doing when she crossed that line with Jack, and while Emily had confronted her, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. Ava had stolen something that was never hers to take. She had stolen the life Emily had built. It wasn't until a week later, when Emily received a text message from Jack, that everything started to truly unravel. It was short, simple, and to the point. "I need to talk. Can we meet?" There was no apology, no mention of the affair, just a simple request to meet. Emily felt a tight knot form in her stomach. She knew this wasn't just about reconciliation, it was about closure. The questions that had been left unanswered, the things left unsaid between them, had been hanging like an albatross around her neck. She had thought she could ignore them, pretend like they didn't matter, but now, as Jack's message lay on her screen, she realized she couldn't move on without confronting him one final time. She agreed to meet him, choosing a small, quiet cafe at the edge of town. The thought of seeing him again, of hearing his voice, sent a strange mix of emotions through her. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand more answers, to make him feel the weight of what he had done. Another part of her wanted to hear him say the words she had longed to hear, something, anything, that would bring back the man she had once loved. But the truth was, she knew deep down that there was no going back. What was broken could not be mended. What was lost could never be reclaimed. When she arrived at the cafe, Jack was already sitting at a table by the window, his face haggard, his eyes tired. He didn't look like the man she had known. He looked small, defeated, as though the weight of everything he had done had aged him beyond recognition. She stood there for a moment, gathering the strength to approach him. When she finally sat down across from him, the air between them was thick with unsaid things. "Emily," Jack began, but his voice faltered. He cleared his throat, trying again. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "You never meant for it to happen?" Emily's voice was tight, a thread of anger running through her words. "It wasn't an accident, Jack. You made choices. Over and over again. And those choices destroyed everything." He looked at her, the pain in his eyes undeniable. "I'm sorry. I know I can't fix it. I wanted you to know that I've realized everything. I've ruined my life, and yours, too. I'm so sorry for what I did to you." But Emily wasn't listening anymore. She had already heard it all, heard the apologies, heard the pleas, heard the promises. None of it mattered now. The damage had been done, and there was nothing that could undo it. "Jack," she said, her voice steady now, "you can't fix this. And neither can I. It's over." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jack sat back, as if the weight of her words had finally sunk in. Emily felt the finality of it, the full, crushing impact of the loss. She had made the decision to let go, to walk away from the wreckage of their marriage. But even as she did, she couldn't escape the profound emptiness that remained in its wake. Jack stood up and walked out, leaving Emily alone at the table, staring at the life she had once known. The consequences of their actions were now irrevocable, and nothing would ever be the same again. But as Emily sat there, staring out the window, she realized that she had taken the first step toward healing. Even if the past could not be changed, the future was still hers to define. The days following the final confrontation with Jack were slow, almost agonizingly so. The house, once filled with the chaotic energy of family life, now felt suffocating in its emptiness. The children returned from their sleepover, their laughter echoing through the rooms like a faint memory of a time before everything had changed. Emily smiled for them, played the role of the attentive mother, but inside, the ache of what had been lost gnawed at her relentlessly. Her heart was torn between two opposing forces, the relief of having taken control, of having freed herself from the weight of betrayal, and the deep sadness of knowing that the family she had once dreamed of was now forever shattered. Every day felt like a delicate balancing act, keeping the peace for her children while facing the emotional fallout of her fractured marriage. She had made her choice, but there was no denying that the cost had been far greater than she had ever anticipated. In the weeks that followed, Emily found herself spending long hours in silence. She avoided the places where memories of Jack lingered, the living room couch, their old bedroom, the kitchen where they had shared so many mundane, yet meaningful moments. Every corner of the house seemed to hold the ghosts of their past life, reminding her of a time when things had seemed so perfect, so easy. But now, everything felt heavy. The house was just a house, a place where the past was stored but had no place in the future she was trying to build. Jack had moved out of town, not far, but far enough for Emily to avoid him, and their contact had become minimal. He sent occasional texts to check in, but Emily had stopped responding. She knew there was nothing left to say. The apology, the guilt, the desperate attempts to salvage what was beyond repair, it all meant nothing now. The truth had been exposed, and their marriage had been irrevocably broken. But even as the pain and anger began to settle into something more manageable, a deep sense of loneliness crept in. Emily missed the parts of her life with Jack that hadn't been tainted by the betrayal, the shared moments of joy, the late-night talks, the plans they had made together. She missed the feeling of being part of something, a family that had a future together. Now, she was left with only the fragments of those memories, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the emptiness. She threw herself into work, into the routines of motherhood, trying to fill the space with something, anything, that would distract her from the gaping hole in her heart. But it wasn't enough. She was beginning to realize that it wouldn't be enough. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She had to rebuild, not just for her children, but for herself. One afternoon, as she sat alone in the park with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the children play in the distance, Emily came to a startling realization. She had been so focused on the destruction of her marriage, on the pain Jack had caused her, that she had forgotten to consider what she needed to heal. The betrayal had broken her, yes, but it had also given her something, freedom. The freedom to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage, outside of her roles as a wife and mother. The freedom to explore her own desires, her own goals, her own future. The pain would always be there, but it was no longer going to define her. Emily decided, in that moment, that she wasn't going to be consumed by the past. She was going to build a new life. One that was not defined by Jack, not by the affair, not by the mistakes they had both made. It would take time, it would take healing, but she would do it. For her, and for her children. She started taking small steps, reconnecting with old friends she had lost touch with, pursuing hobbies she had long since abandoned. She began working on herself, not just physically, but emotionally. The process was slow, sometimes painful, but every day felt like progress. She had learned that healing wasn't a straight path. It was full of setbacks, of moments when the past seemed too overwhelming to face, but it was also full of victories. Small victories, like getting out of bed some days, like smiling at the sunrise, like choosing to move forward. One evening, as she tucked the children into bed, Emily stood in the doorway of their bedroom, watching them sleep peacefully. In that quiet moment, she felt a calm settle over her. The storm inside her had subsided, not because it had disappeared, but because she had learned to live with it. She had learned to carry it. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she would face it on her terms. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman staring back at her. She was different now. Stronger. More aware of her worth, her boundaries, and her capacity for resilience. The woman who had been devastated by Jack's betrayal was still there, but now, she had a fire in her eyes, a resolve that wouldn't be broken. She was no longer the woman who had silently endured. She was the woman who had fought back. And no matter what came next, she would keep fighting. As Emily walked away from the mirror, she knew that the journey ahead would be challenging. But she also knew that she had the strength to face whatever came her way. She wasn't alone, she had her children, her friends, and most importantly, herself. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. What do you think about Emily's journey? Do you think she made the right decision in confronting Jack and Ava? How do you think she will rebuild her life moving forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you've ever experienced betrayal or faced challenges in your own relationships, we invite you to share your story with us. How did you find your strength again? What helped you through the tough times? Your thoughts and experiences matter. Join the conversation and be part of this community. Don't forget to like and share if you found this story inspiring. Your support means the world to us.